At the New York World's Fair in 1930, records point to a scene that attracted visitors. A Hopi woman in ritual attire and side-roll hairstyle presented her twin babies. The episode took place in an area dedicated to indigenous cultures, where motherhood and clothing illustrated daily practices and the identity of the Hopi people. In the late years of the 19th century, the figure of Rattlesnake Pete emerged on the 𝗽𝗵cie Indian Reservation in Oregon. There, Cayuse, 𝗽𝗵cie, and Walla Walla communities negotiated adaptations to federal policies, the presence of missionaries, and regional markets. Ritual traditions persisted while the government agency imposed schools and land limits. In 1885, Ben Whittick photographed Sergeant Jim, an Apache scout from White Mountain. The image documents the role of scouts in U.S. Army campaigns in the Southwest when they acted as guides and mediators between troops and villages. The portrait became a source for studies on indigenous leadership and the frontier at the end of the Apache Wars. In 1900, in New Mexico, Native women from different peoples sold pots in local markets. The practice combined livelihood and tradition. They shaped the clay, polished, painted, and fired it in open pits, following inherited techniques. The pieces circulated as utensils and currency, reinforcing community networks and ties with settlers. Around 1930 in New Mexico, a scene of Navajo cultural life was recorded, riders competing in a traditional outdoor game. In a wide area typical of the arid plateau, they rode horses, a central axis of the economy and community prestige. The activity brought families together, reinforced alliances, and passed down riding skills within the festive calendar. In the early years of the 20th century, 𝗽𝗵cie𝘁cie𝘀 Apache chief was already living as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, after his 1886 surrender. Even so, his trajectory and campaigns against U.S. and Mexican troops continued to shape his public image, turning him into a symbol of indigenous resistance and military leadership. In 1925, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the musical event Feast took place. Local records indicate the presence of a singer of Cherokee origin, whose performance combined traditional repertoire and contemporary pieces. The occasion marked an exchange between indigenous communities and the urban public, consolidating the feast as an annual cultural rite. In 1900, photographer Carl Wertens, known for documenting Native American peoples, captured the portrait of Chief 𝗽𝗪cie𝘁će's daughter, a leader of the White River Apache in Arizona. The composition highlights clothing, posture, and ornaments, positioning her as a figure of lineage and signaling the place of the chief's family in the village's social order. In 1890, in Montana, Eddie Gray, son of White Elk, a figure of the northern Cheyenne community, was recorded. His name appears as a link between lineages and ritual practices. In this context, federal assimilation policies and the Dawes Act pressured the maintenance of land and customs, while Western expansion advanced over the territory. In 1899, photographer F.A. Reinhardt captured the portrait of Good Eagle, Wanbli Waste in Lakota, a member of the Oglala Lakota. The image, produced at the end of the 19th century, is part of a cycle documenting Plains indigenous peoples, then under strong U.S. state pressure, and highlights the position of his subtribe among the 7 Lakota divisions. Joseph White Bull was a Dakota warrior and chief nephew of Sitting Bull, Lakota leader. Born around 1849, he fought in 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn in present-day Montana, when, according to his own account and Sioux oral tradition, he killed Colonel George Custer. He lived under the reservation system and died in 1947 at age 98. Chief Two Sticks, or 𝗫𝗄𝗃, was a Lakota leader on the Great Plains. He was part of the 𝗽𝗵cie𝘁cie𝘁, 7 council fires, the Sioux Confederation with collective leadership. He acted in diplomatic and military decisions. He received the name Nomkapa, knocks down 2, after fighting UTEs and felling 2 horses with a single blow of a war club. Last Horse, Oglala Lakota warrior and leader, acted on the U.S. plains in the late 19th century. After years of clashes against settler expansion, he surrendered to the Army in 1899, among the last ones. Transferred to a reservation, he lived under Indigenous confinement policies and died in 1909. His trajectory signals the end of the Plains Wars. The photograph records a Cherokee woman, a native people of North America, with a baby in her arms, possibly her child. The setting is Oklahoma, where many indigenous people were removed after the 19th century. Taken in the 1920s, the image fits into a moment of federal assimilationist policies and community reconfigurations. The photograph records a Cayuse man known by several names: Dr. Whirlwind, Charlie Saplish, and 𝗽𝗵cie𝘁់. A member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, he lived on the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon, USA. The image was taken by Lee Morehouse, active in the early 20th century, dedicated to documenting Native practices and leaderships. In the image is Mrs. Thunderbear, a Lakota woman known as an interpreter among the Sioux, a people of the northern U.S. plains. The record from 1891 is situated after the Indian Wars. Under federal confinement policies, the Sioux lived on reservations, reshaping political and cultural life. Her role mediated between tribal leaders and federal agents. A Blackfoot woman in a fur coat and felt hat holds in her arms a child also wrapped in fur, staring at the camera with curiosity. The record from the late 1880s is by Ross Alexander, a photographer dedicated to portraits of indigenous peoples. The image fits into the context of transformations and policies of cultural assimilation. Nettie Morris, young Nez Perce, is portrayed in 1900 in Lapwai, Idaho. She wears a long, light-colored dress with embroidery, fringes, and a beaded necklace. Her hair, in 2 braids, falls over her shoulders. The portrait conveys serenity. She belongs to a people of the Pacific Northwest, heirs of the ancient plateau culture, then subjected to assimilation policies. In 1910, Chief Anatlas Anyalahash, a Tlingit leader from the Pacific Northwest coast, was photographed wearing a chilkat blanket. Woven of mountain goat wool and yellow cedar bark, the piece features geometric patterns and figures of sacred animals. Used in rituals and dances, it signified prestige and authority within the Tlingit community. Duncan MacDonald, Flathead leader and historian, appears alongside his wife Mary Agnes at their home in Ravalli, Montana, c. 1901. The portrait, by N.A. Forsyth, is part of his effort to document local indigenous peoples. Son of a Scottish trader and a Flathead woman, MacDonald worked in the defense of rights and the preservation of his people's memory. In 1880, 2 Apache women pose in front of a wickiup, a shelter of bent branches covered with leaves or hides, built in an arid area of Arizona, near a water source. Recorded by Noah H. Rose, the scene is part of efforts to document indigenous life, work, and mobility amid U.S. expansion and tensions with federal authorities. A gesture of cordiality between a white man and a Cheyenne native on the western plains at the end of the 19th century. The handshake may refer to the post-Civil War period, 1861-1865. At that time, Cheyenne and Arapaho, allies of the Sioux, inhabited the region and resisted American troops who advanced to occupy their lands and decimate the buffalo. In 1916, 𝗽𝗵cie 𝘁ćģ recorded a young Apache woman in the arid U.S. Southwest. She carries, balanced on her head, a basket ola made of braided straw, used to store water obtained from seasonal rivers or wells. The scene highlights water supply practices and women's work in the villages during a time of intense ethnographic documentation. In 1873, men tasked with measuring and mapping lands of the American West used a travois, an A-shaped wooden frame for dragging, to carry instruments and supplies. The scene was recorded by William Henry Jackson, famous for Yellowstone and for participating in U.S. government geological and geographic expeditions. Studio portrait of 𝗽𝗵cie𝘁់White Horse of the Pawnee Nation. He served as a guide and ally of the U.S. Army in campaigns against Plains peoples. The photo is from 1870, about 2 years after he joined the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone. The author, William Henry Jackson, a Civil War veteran, was a pioneer of Western photography. 𝗽𝗵cie was a native of the Comanche Nation, a Ute-Aztecan-speaking people who controlled the southern plains between the 18th and 19th centuries. He lived in Oklahoma, incorporated as Indian Territory after federal removal policies. The region recorded contact with settlers and the U.S. Army. He was born in 1911. His death is not recorded in the sources. In 1879, 𝗫𝗫cie, a young Hopi from Walpi, Arizona, USA, was recorded by John Hillers, a photographer in federal expeditions. In the image, she sits with her hands on her lap, wearing clothing typical of the group, and behind her is a fabric with geometric patterns. The portrait is part of a series that mapped Hopi daily life and architecture at the end of the 19th century. Geronimo, Apache chief and central figure of resistance to U.S. expansion, was portrayed in 1905 by Edward S. Curtis. In the portrait, he appears serious, wearing a hat and scarf, holding a rifle. The image is part of the project The North American Indian, a documentary collection of more than 40,000 photographs assembled by Curtis, dedicated to Native peoples.